Hello and welcome. I'm John DANCY, Director of International Media Studies and Visiting Professor of Communications at BYU. We live in a time when some congressmen don't even own a passport, when America routinely does not pay its UN debts, and when more news networks are closing bureaus abroad than they're opening them. What's going on? Is America turning inward? Is the world's last remaining superpower turning its back on the rest of the world? And is the press at fault? Here to discuss these questions are Kevin Klose, President and Chief Executive Officer of National Public Radio, former head of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, and formerly a national and foreign correspondent and editor at the Washington Post. He's the author of Russia and the Russians Inside the Closed Society, which came out of his experiences as the Washington Post's Moscow bureau chief. Also with us today is Rod Prince, executive producer of NBC Nightly News Weekend Editions. Before taking that position, he was supervising producer for the nightly news program's investigative and special segment unit. He was a senior producer of the network's coverage of the Republican and Democratic conventions in 1988. We also welcome back John Hughes, my predecessor as moderator of this program. John is winner of the Pulitzer Prize for international reporting and is now editor of the Deseret News in Salt Lake City. He was a foreign correspondent, Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, Director of the Voice of America, and has served as spokesman for both the U.S. State Department and the United Nations. Kevin, let's begin with you. Is the NPR audience interested in foreign news?
Deeply interested, yes. We, so much so that we are expanding our foreign coverage. We've opened our 12th foreign bureau this year, and we have plans to, if we can raise the money, open yet another bureau next year. We find that when we've asked audiences what do they like to listen to most, there are three major pieces that comprise listenership. One, they want good national news, they want good local news, and they very much want good foreign news, comprehensive, that brings them to those places and bring those places to them.
Rod, what's your experience at NBC? Are people interested in foreign news, and how does that affect what you do at Nightly News Weekend?
Well, the Weekend Edition is a different program than Monday through Friday. We have a different mission, and I do think that our audience is more interested in international news than the Monday through Friday audience. But that interest is not at the level it was 15, 20 years ago. And the economics are not right for a network news organization to invest as much in foreign news coverage as it used to. It's regrettable, but and there are things we're doing to try to address the issue. But
there's some interesting statistics from a study done by Claude Moisy, who is a journalist who was at the Harvard's Joan Shorenstein Center. He found that in the 1970s, NBC Nightly News, the weeknight program, devoted 45% of its stories to international reporting. And in 1995, it was 13.5%.
Right.
Has that been borne out in your experience?
Well, I'd say that's probably true, and I think you and I both were with NBC at that time. The problem is, a lot of factors. The Cold War is over. The whole issue of Germany, the whole issue of Russia, no longer are as front of mind as they used to be. You don't have as many American soldiers abroad, so there's not as much interest in the global community now as there was then. And I think the definition of news, what is news, and that's still a definition that is being adjusted almost weekly. But that's a factor that also took away from the international coverage.
Okay, we'll come back to this. John, I want to ask you a question about here in Salt Lake City. Your paper, the Deseret News, is a newspaper that serves one of the most conservative states in the Union. How does that affect the way you cover foreign news?
Well, the Deseret News is the afternoon paper, as you said, John, in Salt Lake City, circulation about 70,000, so it's a regional paper. It's not the New York Times, it's not the Washington Post. On the other hand, many Americans get their international news, or do not get their international news, from papers in this kind of circulation category. Deseret News is probably not typical in that it devotes more space, I think, to international news than most newspapers in this bracket. We run a full page, open page world report every day, as well as several international stories on page one and international stories sprinkled through the paper. And I think we're responding to an audience in this particular state, Utah, which has a lot of foreign involvements. The tremendous foreign trade, the state is very active with trade offices in various countries around the world. Tremendous influx of non-Native Americans. We have Lao, we have Tibetans, we have Kurds, we have Croats. So they obviously have interest in what is going on outside Utah. We have, and this is on the campus of this university, Brigham Young University, at any given week, they have a traveling group of folk dancers or ballroom dancers, or students in China or Russia. Also, Utah is the headquarters of the Mormon Church, which at any time has probably 50 or 60,000 missionaries in the United States or abroad. All those missionaries have ties with those countries when they return. They're young while they're away. Their mothers and fathers have interest in those countries while they're there. So I think, it's probably not typical, and the Deseret News is not typical in that we do quite a bit more, I think, internationally.
So is it what you're telling me that there must be local involvement with international stories for them to rise to a certain level of interest?
Well, I think there has to be local involvement, but my thesis is that sensitive editors have to produce a mix of what readers say they want in the newspaper and what editors intuitively think the readers need to know. And I don't mean to sound pompous about that. But for example, I suppose if, and I'm probably being politically incorrect here, but I suppose if you had asked the average American housewife 5, 6, 7 years ago, would you like to read a deep background story on what is going on in Bosnia? The answer would probably be no. It's far away, it's complex. Every time you ask anybody from the area about the origins of the conflict, they say, well, back in 1200, and all this is very hard to comprehend. But I think good editors would have continued to have that covered and explained in their newspapers, because lo and behold, today the sons of those housewives are in Bosnia or Kosovo, and so clearly there was a considerable significance to that story.
I'm interested that you say this is an editor's decision. You don't do this through a focus group or...
You do it through focus groups, and you heed what the readers say they want to see in the newspaper. But I do think it has to be a mix of what the reader says he or she wants to see in the newspaper and what the editor thinks it is important for the reader to know. Now, I do think there's a further obligation on the part of the editor. I think you have to when you make a decision that I'm going to tell the reader about this story, even if the reader doesn't choose to know about it, I think you have an obligation to make it as compelling, as colorful, as intelligible, and as relevant to the reader's particular interests and needs as you possibly can.
Like, what's the situation on NBC? Do you do similar surveys?
I'm sure someone does. I don't. I follow what I feel is what my instincts tell me. I agree with a lot of what you said, John, but keeping in mind that a newscast is 30 minutes long, you can do a large takeout certainly on Bosnia when it's not in the news. But when you have, because you can add the space if you choose to. We have 30 minutes and we have to do some stories. You do have a group of discretionary stories, and that's where a producer's personal feelings about the validity and the importance of a story will influence what gets on and what doesn't. What we try to do is, and I couldn't agree more on, I call the imaginary viewers Harry and Sally. I think Harry and Sally want to know what this place is where their child is now going to defend people that Harry and Sally may never have heard of. Our responsibility is to provide context, to provide information about what is going on there, the history of it, the factions involved, and to put it in perspective. And television does that. I think when it comes to the huge stories, the big stories, we go in fashion because technology makes it possible to cover a story in a gangbuster fashion. But there is a time, there were plenty of people who saw Kosovo coming. There were plenty of people who saw Somalia coming. These things are not surprises. But when you have 30 minutes, you can't always say to people, in a few months or in a couple years, this is going to be a story that you're going to care about. And that's the dilemma.
One of the problems as a reporter that you always face is that you can see these stories coming, and trying to persuade your editors that it's a story that needs to run in the newspaper or on the radio or on television is a very difficult thing to do. And it's just what you were talking about. Well, are you saying, I'll ask you the same question I asked John, are you saying that there has to be American involvement before it rises to the level of a news story?
No, I don't think there has to be American involvement, but I do think that what helps a story, an international story, cross the threshold is that there's a compelling human component. You didn't have to, the Albanians, for example, in America, knew what was going on. But by the time that conflict in Kosovo was over, everybody knew. And there were great human, dramatic stories, compelling events.
So a story has to be universal in its appeal.
I think that makes a huge difference, yes.
Kevin, Tony Lake, the former National Security Advisor, has a new book out called Six Nightmares, I believe, in which he says that there's a growing gap between what he calls the electronically enfranchised and the rest of the American public, that is, between the elite and the uninterested. Now, one would assume that listeners to Morning Edition and All Things Considered are among the electronically enfranchised. Does that bother you that you are speaking to a limited audience and not to perhaps the mass audience that you would like?
Well, John, we speak to about 15 million listeners a week in a democracy of about 290 million people. So we think there's a big gap for us to fill. What has been happening at NPR is that our audiences have been increasing when audiences to other traditional forms of mass communication broadcast have actually been fracturing and splitting up.
And why is that happening?
The fact is the commercial networks, principally, which have been the major aggregators of audience in the country for broadcast, have pretty much given up on the kind of news and deep current affairs presentation that I think is necessary for the democracy to keep aware of what's going on both in itself and in the world around. And so audiences are coming into their public radio stations because they're not finding it anywhere else. It's just and we're not driven by ratings. We don't, because we're a nonprofit public service broadcasting enterprise, community-based. We don't have some of the issues that are reshaping the commercial landscape. We don't need to have high ratings to earn, to get advertising revenues from the high ratings, and so we don't look at our programming in terms of its rating structures. What we do know is what people want. We also know that there is a thirst in America. We're a nation that is deeply engaged in global transactions. We are almost entirely, since the arrival of the first European settlers, we are a nation of immigrants with enormous ties somewhere else, somewhere up the ancestral line that people can remember, or that they pass down from generation to generation. So there's an instinctive interest, I think, on the part of Americans, even when they don't travel abroad as much as one might like, even though they're not as aware of where Bosnia is. They may not be able to locate it on a map, but there's an instinctive interest. There's another piece of it, and that is that Americans have always been deeply interested in just the drama of life. You know, when an earthquake occurs in a place like Turkey or Iran, among the first nations that is there with international aid and assistance to the victims is the United States. It's been a tradition in this country. We reach out very quickly and very, very dynamically. And so I think that's part of how we all look at news from abroad and how we look at foreign coverage. I would say about Tony Lake's sort of electronically enfranchised, there's another aspect here, and that is the Internet. The Internet is going to allow people worldwide to see what it is that NBC is doing, to see what is being done, for example, what is being broadcast by KBYU because of its website. There are kids in Kazakhstan right now trying to figure out how they can learn about BYU and KBYU because of the presence of the website on their computers. That's a whole new aspect of international contacts.
The earthquake story in Turkey is going to get covered.
Yeah.
The earthquake story in Colombia is going to get covered. Those disasters really are the hard news stories that no one ignores, no matter. And these days, with technology, makes it possible to get to almost any place. A foreign government preventing access to a place, not getting there, no matter how remote it is. But that's a different issue, I think, than the kinds of stories that are thought-provoking and public affairs-oriented and current affairs-oriented. Those things are not, I agree with you, they're not being covered by the networks the way they were.
Let's take an example. This program is being taped on a Monday. Your program, NBC Nightly News, was on the air last night. Over this weekend, just before this Monday, the disaster with the train in Austria happened. The ski train that was going up through a tunnel and caught fire. What did your network do with that?
We sent Ron Allen and a crew, our own people, to Austria, covered that story on location, and I satellited material out of there, edited in London, both Sunday night and Saturday night.
And what was your thought process of covering that story?
It was an automatic thing. 170 people. I think it ended up 155, but we knew that at least 170 people were involved. And I have to say, I never asked the question, were there any Americans? Okay, it turned out that there were a few, but that had nothing to do with the value of the story.
The things that Kevin was mentioning as factors in driving their coverage, do they drive your coverage as well?
Well, I have to say that we are in business, and this is economics. The only way you can make yourself whole economically is to either increase your audience or reduce your costs. But when we, at the time that we began reducing our foreign bureaus, I was the director of domestic news coverage, and I was reducing our domestic bureaus at the same time. My counterpart in foreign news, and I would commiserate, about the fact that we had to make reductions. We closed whole bureaus, and I still have in my office at work a list, and you'll remember this, of all the bureaus we had in 87, 88. I mean, we were in places that we were in Manila, we were Johannesburg, we were everywhere. Now in many of our places that used to be full-blown bureaus, we have offices or a presence. But that was an economic decision driven in large measure by the fact that the American audience was not, it seemed, demanding international news, except the sort that we're speaking of now, where a dramatic incident, a dramatic moment, or a story that eventually made Harry and Sally want to go to a map and find out where, you know, a place is.
Okay.
John, could I just
Yes,
make a
please,
point?
go ahead, John.
Most news organizations are in the business of having to make money. If you don't make a profit, you don't get a budget next year, you're out of business. So I think we all understand that. But beyond the necessity to at least break even, if not satisfy the shareholders with a good profit margin, there are commitments that various news organizations make to stories and parts of the world that really have no economic return. And I'm thinking of papers like the New York Times, which I don't know what their polls would have shown, but for years and years and years there was very little reader interest in Latin America. And yet the New York Times kept 3 bureaus there, and they kept on plugging away. They've kept a correspondent at the UN, Barbara Crissett, wonderful correspondent, as a staff correspondent at the UN now. CNN, bless their heart, keeps a correspondent there because its eccentric owner has a particular interest in the United Nations.
Well, are there different rules for newspapers as for television?
Well, I think so. For example, the Austrian disaster story, aside from the fact that a tremendous loss of life, which would have obviously put that on the front page of our paper, but there are the kind of things which give particular relevance to editors who are looking to tie international news with local interest. That involved a train disaster on the way to a ski resort. Now, this state happens to be particularly interested in skiing. We would ask whether there were any Americans involved, and we would ask if there were anybody from Utah. I think perhaps that is the difference, and that's where you localize the
But that wouldn't necessarily have governed whether it went on the front page.
Wouldn't govern, but if anybody from Utah had been involved, had either been killed or injured, obviously we would have gone through we were talking to the family, getting photographs. What were they doing there? Why were they on that train? And it's a good human interest story, which would give the story an extra dimension for a local reader.
There's an old joke about the paper in Kansas that wrote a story which began, nuclear explosion kills millions, Kansas woman involved.
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
So,
well, we don't go quite that far. But
yeah. Percent of Americans favor an active part for the United States in world affairs. Is it possible that the politicians and the press are just misreading the mood of the American people when they say, "Oh, nobody's interested in that stuff"?
We've just seen a presidential campaign where there was almost no conversation about international affairs. I think that without the fact that there are not rockets with nuclear warheads aimed at us anymore, I think it's taken a lot of the imperatives out of foreign coverage and people's interest and willingness to give up time to learn about it, to either watch it or listen to it or read about it. But you know, the U.S. involvement now is so far-flung, so worldwide. We have interests all around the world. We have embassies and Americans living abroad, engaged in business and educational activities. Almost whenever there's a crisis anywhere, whether there's ever violence or where there's a natural disaster of any sort, Americans wind up getting involved in it. It's simply the nature of the worldwide projection of this very powerful, dynamic democracy. Politicians who turn away from it as a political issue. So the foreign aid piece of the national budget is a sliver. It's a tiny amount, and yet you can look at congressional debates or the congressional record and see people going on for pages and pages and pages of denunciations about foreign aid. The reality is that that kind of political interface for us is very, very, very narrow. But I think, as Rod was saying, at a human level, we are intrinsically interested to know how do things work and why do they work the way they do. We, for example, we sent a correspondent into western Afghanistan, into Taliban territory. The Taliban is this very repressive, kind of secretive, very strange group of people who've taken over most of Afghanistan in the wake of the Afghan civil war and pacified the country. The question we had is, how can a regime, a group of people who are so repressive, so secretive, so really cruel in their meting out of justice, why are they being welcomed in the countryside? And this correspondent went in there with his tape recorder, interviewed a lot of people with the translators, and found out why. And in a series of really compelling reports, explained the human dynamics of how this could be.
I agree with you. It would be impractical for us to do because we can't, it's not television to have one reporter and no camera, and there are issues with it, since television coverage is a team sport principally, and it usually takes a group. But sometimes there is, and I'll say this, there is the possibility now using digital cameras for one person to go in, be a photojournalist, be a reporter, bring their material out and upload it and all of that. I think we'll see more of that in the future, and that is a wonderful story, and it's a story that everyone should, I think people would be interested in. It's just not economical for a news gathering organization, but a magazine show would be perfect for it.
I must say, if I may, just a brief comment on that, Rod. I do believe that in the years not so far away from now, that the paradigm for broadcast television is going to change dramatically. I think it's going to be much less of the big crews. It's going to be much more based on camcorder technology, digital cameras that one person can handle, that is the size of, that big and is unobtrusive and can go into a country like Afghanistan and come back out.
We've seen some of that already, Kevin. You're absolutely right. I think that's the future, and I think that the journalists who are coming out of the explosion that you were describing.
Journalists who are trained here at BYU, for example, in the communications department, must, to get out of here, they must know print, radio, television, and website publishing. They have to know all four of those, and because we see an increasing convergence between all of those technologies. And it's much easier. It's much easier these days. All of our young journalists here are trained to operate a camera. And it's nothing to them. It's maybe a little more difficult. It's nothing to them to go into a situation with a camera by themselves, take the pictures, come back, write the story, edit the story, put the story on the air. That's one person. So I think we're seeing a time when journalists, television journalists, are becoming much more like print journalists.
Yes.
It's not quite the size of a pencil yet, but it's but we're getting there. There's a book, an academic book out last year called Misreading the Public. And the authors say that when Americans gripe about America's peacekeeping burdens, politicians interpret that as a desire for disengagement, when what the people are really probably saying is, we just want somebody else to bear the burdens with us. Do you think that's a factor?
I think the politicians, which has bearing on your earlier question too, John, I think they're behind the curve. I think they're misjudging the public mood. Last year, both USA Today and Knight Ridder, the news organization, did surveys which determined that there was far greater public interest in international news than had been thought. This interest supports NPR, which has an extraordinary commitment to international news. It supports the London Economist, which does splendidly in the United States with a very heavy international content. And when I was at the UN, I remember that we had a Worthland willing to support both financially and politically the United Nations and the Congress of the United States. And that was both on the humanitarian aspect and on the peacekeeping side too.
Well, I'll ask the obvious question. What's going on? Why aren't the politicians on board with this?
I can't answer that. I do think that in part, particularly television news, leaps to a story when the President of the United States makes a commitment or expresses an interest in some far-flung land. The President often dictates the agenda, it seems to me. But I can't explain why the rank and file in Congress, for example, are so backward in following up on the public's information.
I think it's because there are no votes abroad for the person running for Congress, one, and two, most of the federal budget is tied down in programs that cannot be changed anyway. The actual amount of maneuvering room that members of Congress have, aside from adding, as they've been doing lately, adding a lot of extra stuff, foreign aid becomes a kind of false arena for a lot of stuff. When
I was a young reporter, one of the perennial stories used to be the congressmen who went on junkets abroad and took their wives and had a great time in Paris or what have you. Now, as Tom Friedman reports in his book, there are many congressmen who do not own a passport. And Dick Armey, one of the Republican leaders in the House, is reported to have said, I went abroad once, that was enough. And you have to wonder, how can how can America keep up its responsibilities when you have this kind of
Because
attitude?
we're part to blame, because we used to write stories about the junketeers and how their wives went shopping in Rome for 4 days.
The only is just as we were talking earlier about the just ended. No, it's not over yet, though, is it? Maybe it'll be over. The campaign will be over when this program ends.
Right.
But as Kevin was saying,
Perhaps.
during the perhaps we'll have a president-elect by then. But the only references to foreign involvement had a caveat in America's interests. That's a terrific fig leaf, which I think a legislator or a president can hide behind and make the public feel that he or one day she feel as strongly about international perspective as ordinary people do. I really don't think that most people, most Americans, are especially concerned about the international arena. But I do think they realize that they're not getting all of the information that they would like to have when it comes to what's going on in the world.
The kind of minuscule amount of the U.S. budget that goes for foreign aid, and yet in surveys when people are asked how much of the U.S. budget do you think goes for foreign aid, the percentage is always 3, 4, 5% of the U.S. budget, which would be billions and billions of dollars, and it normally runs somewhere between $10 and $15 billion.
You know, John, there's another aspect, I think, to coverage of foreign peoples and foreign events, and it isn't really framed necessarily specifically within the context of hard news or breaking events. It can be formed in the context of culture, and I think there's a lot of interchange going on. There's a lot of access to what's happening abroad, in perhaps not on the news side of the line, but in the entertainment side or the cultural side. In our case, we send production teams. We had a production team a few months ago in Cuba with the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, which was down there doing a tour. We went down there, but we have very little access to it. So cultural events can sometimes become a means by which American audiences or American viewers can have access to it. And I think the internet also is going to provide more interactivity right there. There are kids now all over America who are using their computers to take down world music, and they're engaging it. They're listening to music from Senegal. They're listening to Afro-pop from Ivory Coast and hearing things that they would never otherwise hear. They found new means of distribution that are informing them about perceptions and sensibilities outside this country. So perhaps the entire paradigm is kind of shifting away in a world of non-nuclear confrontation.
Do you think that as America becomes a more diverse country with more nationalities from more different places here, that our interest in foreign news is going to increase?
I think our interest in foreign news is really quite high. I've been all over the country visiting NPR stations. I'll do so here a little bit later today. And I think that because Americans are traveling a lot, most universities, BYU is an extraordinary university for the training in foreign languages with enormous foreign contacts. Kids are going abroad in new ways. I think there's interest there, and I think that the fact that some of the nets have moved away from it is too bad, but it's just, you know, there was a kind of public service or public information component which they don't feel they need to do in the same way. At NPR, I'm not unhappy about that because audiences are coming to us looking for the kinds of things they can't get elsewhere.
Well, you know, the whole audience is fractured anyway. There are more and more entities competing for the attention of the American people, and NPR and NBC and CBS and ABC and the internet and the newspapers and magazines. If you want to, with the internet in particular, if you want to find out what is happening in another country, all you have to do is go to the internet. There are world newspapers there. The thing that I would disagree with you about, though, is I'm not sure that, despite the diversity, I'm not sure that we are becoming or growing interest in international events. People seem to me to be losing touch with anything except their individual homelands, and to have an interest for a Haitian to be interested in what's going on in Haiti, for a Mexican American to be interested in what's going on in Mexico or any other. I don't think that translates to a real indication of interest in international news, merely its interest in the familiar.
Or are you saying we've got to have a crisis before people get interested in international news?
I don't think we have to have a crisis, but I do think that the media is not really in the front end of the problem. I think that the problem begins in schools. I think the problem flourishes with, again, all this, there are so many entities competing for people's attention. You don't have to, in many colleges now, you don't even have to have a foreign language to get in. There is less interest in the world, even though it's smaller, than there was when I was a kid. And I don't think it's the media's fault. I think we aren't helping it. I think we can help solve it if we do the things that all of us are talking about here, which principally includes adding value to stories when you happen to be in a region, when people are focusing on a crisis in a particular place. If you give them enough information, some of it sticks, and maybe, just maybe, an interest, a light bulb will go off, and the interest will remain.
Talk about that phrase of adding value to a story. What do you mean by that?
Well, you do talk about how ethnic disputes began, and you do talk about how what the issues are that are dividing people, because most of the problems now are civil wars or ethnic conflicts rather than political disputes between communism and democracy, socialism, fascism. You know, that the great concepts aren't what it's about.
We kind of liked it when we had a Cold War, didn't we?
Well,
it was easy to understand, easy to explain.
Very simple, you know. It's good and bad, evil and and righteous.
I think there will be, if it's not immediately present, because I think we're confronted by an age of disparate terrorism, both by state means and non-state means of fanatical groups of various kinds. The explosion of the USS Cole while it was in port, killing 17 U.S. sailors. I've read everything I could find about that story and its aftermath, and I must say the New York Times has set an extraordinary record for journalism. They've tried to follow out who were the people who were thought to have who brought the bomb alongside the ship and probably got blown up in the explosion. Where were they from? And they followed them out to the most remote part of the world, a kind of empty desert where there are very tiny populations where people know very little about the outside world, and they have a very specific set of impacted beliefs, fears, and zealotry of a certain kind. I think that the world that's in front of us, where the internet provides lots of information that in normal civil society you don't want to see manufactured, built, or used, I think that we ourselves, as an enormously open democracy, are going to face this exposure in a whole new way. And I think that as this unfortunate reality starts to come in on us and continues to be out there as something we have to deal with, I think we're going to have to learn more about who these other peoples are, so we can learn what the ideologies are and the beliefs that drive them and have a response to them.
I think the internet is a wonderful technical instrument for the transmission of information, but it has one terrible flaw at the moment, and that is that anybody can get on it and proclaim almost anything, and you don't really know who's talking. I love that New Yorker magazine, which shows the dog up at the computer keyboard. The dog is typing away, and and the dog is looking down at another dog sitting on the floor, and the dog who's writing is saying to the other dog, once you're on the internet, they don't know you're a dog. So there, I think it's wonderful. I think it does all kinds of wonderful things, but I think there is no substitute, either on the internet or off the internet, for transmission of information that has been carefully collected, edited, packaged responsibly, and is transmitted in one form or another by a responsible news organization whose name you know and whose reputation you can trust.
Well, that's what I'm speaking of too, though. Newspapers on the web, but the issue that you're raising is a very real one. And when these terrible things happen, there will be a window, and I say when. There will be a window of opportunity for the public to want to know more about what makes someone tick, what issues there are.
Okay. If that happens, people then look for a brand name from whom to get their news. They look at NBC or CNN or the Deseret News or NPR. They want somebody that they know and they trust. But if NBC, for example, is not doing much foreign news these days, then are they a good source for this?
Well, I think that it's not so much how much foreign news we're doing. I think the bigger problem is if we're not in the right places.
Right.
You know, when you have bureaus all over the world and spheres of expertise. There were times when you had people who knew all the right people in all the right places because there were bureaus there. And not having those bureaus certainly puts every journalist at a disadvantage.
Just a personal story. Part of my career at NBC was spent covering first Congress and the White House and the State Department. And the reasons for doing that was that you were there every day and you knew who all the players were, and you knew where the story had been before, and you knew what had led up to it, and so forth. And there was great value that you could add to a news story just simply by being there. And you mentioned Barbara Crossett at the UN. If we don't do that anymore, are we really going to be able to add that value? If journalists just, as the saying is, parachute into a situation and expect to cover it?
I think all of the networks and certainly all of the national newspapers still have people who can provide that first layer of expertise. You know, no one has abandoned the State Department. No one has abandoned the White House. But then you do also have to reach out for additional back into the region to do some real reporting as well. I'm sure that the reporters with the greatest expertise at any news agency are going to come to play when that big story happens, and they probably will have the best information first. But you can never know who that is because everyone has people with real bona fides when it comes to international affairs, even if they're not on station in a foreign country anymore.
How do you do that at NPR, Kevin? Do you have a core of people?
Yes, we have a foreign desk. The foreign editor is Lauren Jenkins, Pulitzer Prize winning reporter from the Washington Post and Newsweek magazine. We have these 12 foreign bureaus, and we have a lot of stringers worldwide whom we draw upon, who are experts in those countries. We also have there's an amazing dynamism that can happen sometimes during the run-up to the NATO bombing in Kosovo to force the Serbs out of Kosovo. A young woman in Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, had access to a computer, and she struck up an email conversation with a young American at Berkeley, in Berkeley, California. And he started talking to us, and we went back through various means and made sure this was in fact who this woman was, who she said she was, young woman. And these letters from this woman became a kind of national fixation for millions of our listeners. They wanted to find out what was happening in her life. And so the dynamics between email, transmitted out, and then brought to National Public Radio. Actually, it wound up on television, and you did a story on it as well. NBC did. So, and that was an issue of the personal, this enormously, emotional, dramatic personal story of this young 17-year-old telling what it was like to live in the capital as the bomb started to come down and what it had done to her life, her parents' life, and the people around her.
But your heart is kind of in your throat when you do that because, as you say, you're not absolutely sure that this person is not working for some other interest or has some other agenda, right?
We found ways to make sure that was the person, that in fact she was 17, she was living in Pristina, and so forth.
Okay, that's an interesting use of the internet. How do you see the internet affecting foreign coverage in what you both do, Rod and John?
Well, I think not a great deal in what we do, because like most regional newspapers, I mean, we don't have foreign correspondents. We have one correspondent outside the state, and that's a Washington bureau chief, a one-man bureau. But he is obviously focused on news affecting our state. So we rely on the New York Times syndicate, Christian Science Monitor syndicate. We buy the LA Times syndicate for weekend use. We use the Associated Press, and we use Reuters. And obviously, we are simply relying on agencies and newspapers and news organizations with a track record and in whom we trust. And that's the way we acquire our foreign news. Now, I should say we do a couple of other things. We're involved in an exchange sponsored by the American Society of Newspaper Editors, where we bring an editor from usually from Eastern Europe, to our newspaper for a month each year. The first editor was from Tajikistan. Then the second was from Georgia, former Soviet Georgia. The year before last, we had a brilliant young editor from Kosovo, and this year we had another brilliant editor, a young woman, from a newspaper in Belgrade, which did not back the Milosevic regime, and she happened to be in our newsroom for a month at a time when her country's government was overthrown. They come to participate in the study of American journalism. She didn't study much American journalism. She was on the internet, and she was on the phone to her colleagues all the time, wrote material for us. We maintain dialogues with all of those people after they go back to their home countries. It's a small thing, but it's a growing thing. And so in ways like that, we draw on non-traditional sources.
Cost, as we've mentioned before, is clearly a problem for everybody in trying to cover foreign news, much more so for television than for newspapers or for NPR, because you've got to have more people involved. Just simply getting all the equipment necessary to a location is very, very expensive. Do you see?
I'm sorry, but let me say that we have, because of MSNBC.com, we have a very vital and vested interest in getting material on the internet. We have people based in London solely assigned as internet reporters, and we send them to these big stories with a digital camera to do things for the web. I think the web is going to be, as broadband technology improves, it's going to be a big.
As a broadcaster, does that bother you? The fact that a few years ago, 66% of Americans, year after year, said they got their news from television. That was their primary source of news. And now it's down to around 55%. Well, that's a fractionated audience. You're not able to deliver as many viewers per dollar as you have been in the past. Do you see these other sources of news, particularly the internet, as diminishing your audience and therefore your budget and your effectiveness?
Yeah, I do see them. I think the ship has left port, and as far as that's concerned, I think that the audiences will continue to dwindle.
Well, how do you cover news then? If you've got less audience, less budget, how do you cover news?
Well, it began as a public service, and I think it still is a public service. If all we have to do is break even, then I think we just have to find more creative ways, partnerships, and other things to do the job. But I don't think there's anything we can do to prevent the bifurcation.
I think we probably all have a vested interest in seeing more foreign news on the air. So we're not totally neutral observers in this. How do we do that?
I think there will be more exchanges by internet and more things using the sort of alternative and new platforms such as MSNBC, which will be able to aggregate stories and experiences across the internet. We'll be able to prove them out, edit them properly, and get them on the air if it wants to capture them. And if MS doesn't do it, we're going to do it. Yeah. I believe strongly that NPR has to look at the video side of the internet very carefully, but nevertheless we have to be there. There are web cameras now that are the size of barely larger than a pencil. People can transmit image around the world instantaneously.
Are you telling me that NPR is about to become a video content provider?
We're interested in learning how to do a high-quality video presentation of, in effect, the radio experience. The thing about radio is that radio is unlike television and unlike newspapers. And since I came out of newspapers, I think I know what I see and what I hear. Radio is really a mass medium of the imagination because you can't see it. You can be doing other things in your life, and it's just a companion with you in a way that television and newspapers are not. I believe that is a magical kind of space. If we start televising it, it's going to take away the magic. It won't be a medium of the imagination anymore, of what you create in your mind. It will be a medium of what you show. So if we're going to use video, which we really have to do because video is part of what the internet is. The internet is text, audio, and video. It's all merged together. And it's also on demand, and it's people interacting with each other in new ways. We must be able to present the visualization somehow of that encounter in a creative way, in an artistic way if we can do it, in a way that resembles the way we do radio, which is very, very high quality stuff.
We're looking at a period, perhaps for the next 2 decades or so, where the United States is going to have to be a sort of, as somebody has said, global sheriff for the rest of the world in trying to put down disorders and keep the world sort of moving along in the same direction. How are we going to do that? How is the new president going to build the consensus for that kind of action if people don't know what's going on in the rest of the world and don't much care?
I think one thing a president can do is to make sure that the rules that allow the media, reporters, to travel, to go out with the military forces that are doing peacekeeping activities and so forth, should be very inclusive, so that camera teams and reporters and the media in general can be on scene and report back the drama of trying to do, in effect, peacekeeping in nations or areas in conflict.
Newspapers have a unique responsibility, John, because you can publish longer pieces that would not be possible for NBC and to some extent not for NPR. Do you see that as a
well? I think
responsibility?
that too. No insult intended to electronic journalism, but they say that television covers big news absolutely superbly. But they do say that television is the medium of the visual medium, whereas the newspapers are the medium of ideas. And I'm not saying that in any superior or snobbish way. But however, during my days at the State Department, I do know the networks really picked up on what had appeared in the New York Times that morning and very often and followed it up. But I think newspapers do have an opportunity to flesh out the story, to provide the background, to provide the substance that it's very, very difficult to do in a brief television newscast.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. I've enjoyed the discussion with all of you. It is a question that will continue to intrigue and perhaps plague the news business for years to come. Exactly what proportion to give to foreign news and what proportion to give to domestic news. Thank you all for being our guests today.
on the next Reporting the World.
We live in a time when some congressmen don't even own a passport, when America routinely does not pay its UN debts, and when more news networks are closing bureaus abroad than they're opening.
Join John DANCY, Director of International Media Studies at Brigham Young University, and a panel of distinguished journalists. They consider the question, is America turning inward? On the next Reporting the World.